Good afternoon, everyone. It is a true honor and pleasure to be here and to talk about the two-generational approach or the two-generational framework. I'll first start with explaining what that is. It is pretty much what it sounds like, which is working with equal focus and intensity on the needs of young children and the needs of adults in their lives. If we're really going to be successful in long-term strategies that reduce or eliminate poverty, we have to think both about the families and the children in particular. I want to start with a story. So I am actually a developmental psychologist by education, which means my expertise is in the science of how young children grow and develop. And most of my work has been very focused on early childhood development and child outcomes. And in a former life, I was the director of the Office of Early Learning and had a phone call that forever changed the way that I thought about early learning and the needs of families. Through a mutual colleague, a parent was recommended to call me, and she did, and she said, so I was just offered a 10-cent an hour increase by my employer. But if I've done my math right, I am no longer going to be eligible for school readiness and be able to support my two children with access to quality childcare experiences. And I said, okay, well, let's do your math. And we did the math. You all, that $200 annual increase knocked her out of receiving $8,000 of childcare supports and tuition subsidies, which meant it was a huge deficit and a game changer and really undergirds Mark's opening points and comments. And she said, what do I do? And I said, I'm so sorry, I can't tell you what to do, but it stuck with me how unconscionable that is, that parents would have to choose between opportunities for professional growth, increases to their wages, or meeting the very real needs of their young children. In my current role, I work in the Association of Children's Services Councils, and in the communities of Florida where we have Children's Services Councils, we fund the gaps. We're prenatal to career, and we fund the gaps in services for children, youth, and families. And a few years ago, had an opportunity to start thinking a little bit differently about policies around poverty. And so we started down the path of doing analysis, a lot of it in partnership with the Chamber, and want to share a little bit about what we learned, because what it is thinking differently as in the two-gen approach. So the first thing that we learned is if you look at social service policies in the state of Florida, they're very much designed with individuals in mind. So I'm going to use an illustration, which is my hand, for my very fancy graph. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but if you look at an individual in poverty accessing social services, there is the potential for a straight line, nearly straight line trajectory to economic self-sufficiency. As wage progression goes up, the loss of social services is natural and in place for a true path to economic self-sufficiency. When we ran the same analysis, adding in social services that support children's development, Mark alluded to it, we found three cliffs. There is a cliff for children's health insurance, there is a cliff that I described before for childcare, and there is a cliff for housing. And what it really underscores is the need and opportunity to think differently about policies in our state and think about families with young children who have very different budgetary needs. Their basic survival household budget looks entirely different than an individual who is low income and working. And so how we can think about that is that two-gen framework. So sort of crystallize this for you and begin thinking about what those opportunities might look like is we're actually in the process right now. We've applied for a grant with the National Foundation to look at how we could align childcare and workforce services differently. So Michelle's heard me say this many times. In the last 3 years and being really laser focused on the needs of children and families in poverty, I cannot come up with one policy solution that does not have workforce development at its epicenter, because we all know, and it's been said many times today, we need work-based solutions. We need to be able to support families in their growth and their movement towards economic self-sufficiency. Childcare was selected not just because it's one of my areas of expertise, but also because the Alice report, really my biggest aha moment in serving on the research advisory committee for Alice report was realizing that in all but 5 Florida counties, childcare is more expensive than rent. So when we think about that from a cost prohibitive perspective for families with young children, That's really quite staggering, and we need to rethink our policies and the opportunities. So what we're working on is the potential within communities to demonstrate career progressions without the fear of hitting that fiscal cliff, because childcare is such a significant one. What we see, going back to the parent I described, is she did not take that wage increase. So she did the practice of what we call parking. I'm gonna park right underneath the eligibility threshold because it's in my child and my family's better interest that I do that. And so what we want is to not have that happen, obviously, and to develop career pathways and progressions where as wages increase, families take on a greater cost share of the child care burden, but not completely fall off of that cliff, not practice parking. And so we're working on aligning this. It is not anything that sounds, when I first had the idea, I said, this certainly, somebody else is doing this, right? Somebody else in the United States of America is doing this work and thinking through it. But what we couldn't find was anyone that was thinking about how do you model that graduated phase out, is what we call it. How do you model what that childcare cost continuum looks like? How do you model high wage, high demand career projections and lattices? And we've partnered with the Department of Economic Opportunity on this, that really help families understand this is the job I can have now, and there are stackable credentials and certifications that lead to the next level, to the next level, and I can do that without losing money as I work towards economic prosperity. So that's an example of, there are a lot of different 2-gen approaches, but this incredible framework that really will allow us to rethink some of the policies that have created indirect barriers for families, unintentional barriers for families. Also reduces things like toxic stress in the household, which is great for children's development and where I really focus on, and recognizing that if we can stabilize economic development for that household, what a game changer it is for children. So when we want to think about long-term changes as well, that's the benefit of thinking with a 2-gen framework. So really appreciate, I think, this conversation, and I enjoy all of my time serving as a trustee, but is one of the most important and profound conversations, and I so appreciate the Chamber for starting it and really appreciate the opportunity to share with you all a little bit about 2-gen.